Welcome back to Side Quest, episode 30, Final Fantasy VII, episode 18. Today, a special episode of Side Quest where we talk about fantasy, video games, and addiction, and joined not only by my esteemed colleague, Mr. Wesley Shantz, but also my esteemed colleague, Dr. Matthew Roos from the Consilience Conversations. Welcome, Dr. Roos. Welcome, Mr. Wesley Shantz, for this special episode.
Yeah, thanks, Alex.
Thank you.
Good to be here as always.
And so, well, Matt, we've been talking about this video game, Final Fantasy VII from 1997, that was pivotal, we think, for sort of older millennials getting into their 30s now for this generation. And we've been, just like we've been talking about Harry Potter, and just like you and I have sort of been talking about the connections between neuroscience and literature, this game seems to have had a major, what we're talking about in this game is just the major influence it has had on the psyche of people who are alive today. And so since we've been talking a lot about that, we thought we might talk a little bit about some of the dark sides of video games. Obviously, some of the positives are eye-hand coordination, teamwork, working towards a goal, all sorts of things. But also, we wanted to talk a little bit about addiction today. And since you're sort of, you're the neuroscientist that we know, we thought we might mine you for some information on this and see what sorts of connections we can make in about 45, 50 minutes and, try and put something good out there.
Yeah, happy to do what I can. I don't know how deeply we can mine, since it's, as I've always said on the Consilience conversations, that's not my, this is not my sort of area of expertise, but happy to share some information with your listeners.
All right. Well, so do you guys think we should start with, I've just shared for the YouTube listeners the spreadsheet for this time. So we have written out here core components of addiction, a couple articles, this thing called internet use disorder, which we could explain, whether video game playing can, strictly speaking, be called an addiction, and why is that an important question? And is there some concept creep going on here? Seems to be the bit. Also, we wanted to talk a little bit about this crazy condition out east called hikikomori, where the criteria for it, when I was reading the criteria, they're just incredible. It's something like 6 months without leaving one's home completely.
I think there have been situations where people have died, and I guess that's a serious hallmark of that condition.
That's insane. And so, actually, I don't know, just that kind of catches my attention immediately. Wes, how about, would you be interested in us starting hikikomori or going in a different direction?
No, that sounds good, because the question I was kind of thinking about here, and welcome again, Matt, to the show. We sort of just free associate a lot, so try to bear with me here. The question I was kind of thinking about was like, what makes video games and playing them a lot different from playing other kinds of games too much? It seems like to me, gambling is a pretty clear area where we can talk about that being an addiction because it has such negative consequences that impact you kind of right away. Or if you're really lucky, super positive consequences over and over, I guess. But
next time.
Video game. Well, with the video game though, it's like, yeah, if you're sort of like in your house all the time and not out and about, I guess I can start to see how that is quite different from like playing sports too much, or playing hopscotch too much, or something like that. What do you think about that?
Well, let me just add to, as you well know, I'm sure there's, of course, gambling disorders have been around for a long time and known as such. Of course, now we have lots of online gambling options available. Of course, in the U.S., it's restricted to various degrees, and there are some ways to get around that. So sort of your analogy or your statement about people sort of shutting themselves away in the house, just playing and playing and playing. Well, the same thing, I suppose, could be said for, various forms of gambling. But I think you hit on something right away there that is important to point out, which is that, we can talk about a little bit more about some of the data or some of the findings, but, gambling is something that has been compared to addiction. And I'm going to use that term loosely, since it's, of course, as we'll discuss, can be defined in a variety of ways and hasn't necessarily been officially defined as a, video game addiction hasn't actually been defined as an addiction. But nonetheless, there's some relationships there from the sort of neuroscience side between gambling and sort of, I guess, again, addiction, such as it is to video games.
I do want to talk about that and how that might also relate to the 5-factor model as well. But I'm also interested in understanding, because that is such an interesting distinction that I didn't make that you two did, about why it is that playing this game specifically in an isolated way at home would have such a deleterious effect on your health, potentially. Can
I interject something?
Yeah,
just throw a question here, because I don't know a lot about this specific game. I'm from, we'll say, half a generation before you, Alex. But I certainly played, I grew up with computers, and they were, sort of new and available to the middle income household. And so, of course, I had video games, and I was, I nerded out like some of the best today and played role-playing games. But I saw a progression from solely text-based games, like those who might be listening might know the Infocom company. They were sort of originators of a lot of these text-based games where, a description of a scene or a room is put on the screen, you read it, and then you, in sort of somewhat normal language, type out your response to what you want to do. And then the next level is finally you see some better graphics, but they are miserable by today's standards. And then they progress more and more towards sort of the deep immersion role-playing games or first-person shooter games and things like that we see today. So I'm sort of not really where I'm going with that, other than I think, even in those days, I'm sure there were people that could get addicted to those sort of more simplistic games. But what I really wanted to point out or ask you about is the degree to which, sometimes it's claimed that now that the games have gone online and you're playing with a group of other people, sure, you may be locked away in your room or, away from other people, but you are, in some sense, actively engaged with other people just in a virtual world.
Okay, so that's my question.
Have some conversation during that you can type into or actually verbally speak. But maybe you can comment on that and how you think that might relate to, our conversation today.
Yeah, so there are just two parts of that I think we can nail down if we look at them specifically. Because I think we need to look at the aspect of addiction, which is negative impact. Because how you portray it there seems fine, right? If you're normally adapted to the world and this is just one of your habits and you communicate in the most appropriate way, you're not addicted, you're playing the game appropriately, that's fine. But what I think is operant here, and maybe getting at the heart of Wes's question, is, are you utilizing the social circuitry you have, like the extroversion circuitry you have, and getting hits for it without getting the actual social benefits or social effects of being around people, right? So you don't have like people's looks moderating how you sort of act, behave, what you say, how you present yourself, how you look. You're sort of isolated without any feedback from people about your actual physical embodiment. You're only getting feedback about sort of your behavior within this digital world where your character is not experiencing the same entropy as you are.
Yeah. Well,
right?
Certainly, actually, you can't argue with that. And I think it's pretty clear, and it doesn't take a psychologist or a neuroscientist to see sort of behavioral problems that might arise, or to imagine that some behavioral issues might arise from that. One thing I read, and maybe you did, both of you guys may have read this as well, but, that Japanese term, hikikomori, about a person who shuts himself up in a room is sort of, I suppose, a loose translation. But I was reading a little bit further about these conditions that are, I guess, maybe it's a diagnosis in those cultures. There are people that they try to treat they become so ignorant, not stupid, but just sort of ignorant of social cues and eye gaze and looking at someone's face and sort of interpreting what might be going on in that person's mind. They actually have training videos that these people may watch in order to try to relearn, if they ever had known at all, how to read people's gaze and sort of get an emotional awareness based on their outward nonverbal behavior. So I think what you just described there, Alex, is, this is what I just described as indicative of what might happen if you if you're playing these games and cut off from sort of real world social cues, you're totally immersed in this game that has a very limited and constrained range of social situations.
Well, and that's so interesting too. And then I just want to bounce it back over to you, Wes, just because this guy that Wes and I have both listened to, Jordan Peterson, Dr. Jordan Peterson, often references Jean Piaget, who was a constructivist, I think Swiss psychologist, though he called himself a developmental neuroanatomist or something like that.
Mm-hmm.
When he and one thing he talks about is that a lot of human socialization happens between the ages of 2 and 4. And so I'm not sure which part of the brains are developing fastest then, but probably some pretty social ones. And that the kids that are not socialized appropriately by the age of 4 never catch back up with everyone else. Because it seems like what a human life is that humans are progressing at whatever the rate their sort of mental processing allows them to do, maybe their IQ or their G, and that if you fall behind at a very important or imprinting sort of age, you just never catch up. And just thinking about adolescents here getting addicted to video games, or even possibly adults, I wonder to what extent this is a version of that. If you spend this much time using your adaptive capacity to adapt to a virtual world rather than the world at large, to what extent are you losing all that time and ability that you would be producing to deal with the world at large, and that you never get back? And so not only is there a problem once you get caught by this addiction, but there may be potential, consequences all the way down the line afterwards too, that you may socially always be behind afterwards, potentially.
So I'm thinking about this maybe in a weird way, but see what you guys make of this. Like in our time, when you have some kind of social or some kind of problem like this, you might hole up in your room and play video games all day, right? For people before now who had this kind of thing go on, I'm kind of thinking that it was probably that they would become like monks, or like they would hole up and maybe do other sorts of substances, right? Whether it's books or opium or something like that, right? But in any case, these are all sorts of like ways of trying to adapt, I guess, to a situation that one feels very poorly equipped for. That seems to be sort of the motivation, insofar as there is one, that could drive somebody to do this. And I wonder, like, in that time, in the medieval ages, the monastery was, a very high status place in society, whereas now people who hole up in their rooms are sort of a problem, right? They're something that society needs to sort of try to solve or deal with, or bring back into the fold. I don't know if that's like too much of a stretch, that analogy, but just as a kind of, I don't know, experimental approach to this, what would a center that would treat this, what would it look like now, and how would it sort of get at those deeper issues? If, as you say, like by the time you're 4 years old, it's too late. Well, shoot, what do we do?
That is so interesting that you make that connection to a monastery, which is also deeply connected with the history of the university, which is another place outside the normal way of things where people get to consider the nature of things, right? And so they don't have to keep up with the news, but can think of the good news, or that which is always substantive, not that which is simply temporal, because it's impossible to keep up. But what happens when, and we do still have places like that too, right? If one becomes addicted to a drug, like one becoming addicted to a video game, like we're suggesting here, you can go to a rehabilitation center, which is outside the normal course of time and activity, right? You're not expected to keep the same hours that you keep in life. You won't be around the same people. It's sort of like a place outside, like a summer camp or something like that. And I would say even summer is sort of the season that is also like that. And also, late winter as well. In fact, the Greeks had a month that had an undefined amount of days. It was around 40, where they didn't keep time. And so, yeah. So, yeah, Matt, what do you make of this this idea, this.
Well, let me, let me add to that, or just comment on it. I think there's one thing two things. I'll preface it first by saying, Wes, you didn't say it explicitly, but I think sort of what can also be inferred by that, those statements is that, the accessibility that we now have, that are for certainly younger people have, to close themselves off from society and playing these games, is part of the reason we see this addiction. Of course, it wasn't available before. And so whether it was 50 years ago or hundreds of years ago, when the monasteries were sort of more popular, I guess, sure, maybe that would have been one way someone who had these sort of underlying, perhaps social challenges, that might be one of their solutions. Or it's also it's also likely that they just outgrew it, because they didn't have they couldn't sort of take the strategy of dodging society as easily as they might be able to today. And so they were forced to interact with society, and eventually they might have been sort of behind on a developmental curve, but they came about. It happens all the time with children, and they're a little bit behind in the reading, but don't worry about it. They'll be fine in another year or so. One thing that came to my mind, though, that since you mentioned monasteries, is this is perhaps treading into some dangerous waters, but as we know, with the Catholic Church and all their challenges with sexual predators and with some of the clergy, and let's preface it by saying, I'm sure most of the clergy are great, decent human beings, and we don't need to be, I don't want to pigeonhole anybody or stereotype anybody, but it may be that even in modern society, or recent modern society, the church, whether not necessarily a monastery, but if someone felt awkward in various ways socially, they may still they may be attracted to a job or profession where there's sort of limited or constrained social situation. So that could be the church, or it could be a librarian, or, just make up some things, where forest ranger, these sort of things where you can sort of isolate yourself. So it's possible that people in the past would have taken those routes, but it's also, I think, quite possible that a lot of people sort of outgrew it, or never had recourse to hold themselves up and sort of prevent their development in such a disastrous way.
Well, that makes me think so much that so many of our sort of conditions are a prospect, or precisely because of how wealthy we are as a people, right? Like a food addiction requires food, plenty of it too, and the economic system necessary to produce the income necessary to buy food easily, like we can, and then engorge on it. Sex as well. There needs to be a certain limiting of disease and sexually transmitted disease to have a society liberal enough in order to have the mores we do about sex. That's actually shown. Peterson references a study, which I'd have to look at, which I could find easily, that shows that the rate of disease prevalence in the society has a 0.6 correlation with the strictness of their sexual mores. And so there seems to be a direct connection between disease prevalence in a society and strict moral codes, especially when it comes to regulation of the motivational system of, seeking sex. And so I'm wondering to what extent, our culture, because we're rich, allows us to manifest more of these primary motivational systems so that they can, to some extent, run more rampant in our luxurious and rich culture, but also provide us with more food and information about the presence and the nature of these motivational systems and how to regulate them, because of just how frequently they manifest themselves in illnesses or diseases in our culture.
The question I have about that is, like, what role advertisers and marketers have in promoting this? Like 50 years ago, the cigarette companies were extremely skillful at marketing their product to people, and it was addictive, and they knew it, and they made a lot of money at it. And I think that's like a pretty fair analogy, I guess, to what now you have, like cell phone games or smartphone games or whatever, right? Like little apps that they give you like a hit of the good stuff when you play them, and then you want to play them over and over. And then pretty soon there's a little ad there in the corner, and you sort of notice it like 1,000 times before you realize that you really want to buy that thing, that ad is, it keeps flashing up on the screen, so I don't know, like, this is probably something that there have been lots of studies on, and there, probably studies paid for by the various companies with the stake in what the studies find. But, just what role affluence, yes, but also the particular kind of affluence that is so driven by marketing and advertising.
Hey, did I lose you guys?
No, we're here. We're here.
Sorry. Yep. Sorry to you and your listeners. That was reminding me of something. Oh yeah, and to take that one step further, some of the game producers or manufacturers give you a hit of the good stuff, as Wes said, but they also they recognize that you needed a certain. It's tied into that. The complexity of the game increases over time, or I should say, it adapts to your skill level. So if you're not playing well enough to be rewarded at a frequent enough pace, the game difficulty might decrease so that you are rewarded and will continue to want to play. So it's pretty interesting. I think one of those links in the on the YouTube page there that we're showing, one of those papers highlights that a little bit, where really people who studied psychology have been, cooperated or worked with gaming companies to increase the degree to which, the player will want to continue playing. So it's definitely big business, and advertisers and just game manufacturers are certainly in there, and they're paying attention to what at a minimum, the psychiatric studies or the psychological studies say about these things.
Yeah, and I was less interested, not that I'm not interested, in what the ethics of an advertiser are, what his responsibility was, and more how we could apply these behavioral principles of appropriate interval release of reward and incentive reward with the appropriate fixed or variable ratio to education to keep students engaged, and to what extent. And this is what I thought in relation to advertising. Now, obviously, advertisers do use whatever neuroscience and market research they can get their hands on in order to, motivate you to buy what they have. Sure. But to what extent is education, a good education, supposed to teach you about the presence of those motivations inside of yourself so that they cannot be used to manipulate you? And to what extent is the purpose of an education to teach you how to wield those tools yourself and also to defend against them, to be able to use your rational intellect, or, your conscious thinking ability to sort of not override those motivations, but to understand how things are molded around you to affect your perception of them.
I would want to respond to that comment in a slightly different, perhaps indirect way, or take it on a slight tangent. It would seem that we are, these kind of addictions, again, if you will, that we're amenable to these, or we can be, drawn into them. But part of it is that when it comes to a video game addiction, what we're addicted to is not, it's not a physical thing. It's not food. It's not sex, which is physical in a certain way, but it induces certain hormonal transmissions, and so that's the sort of what makes us feel good, and therefore that's the reward. But what it indicates is that we are sentient beings, and we sort of sometimes develop our own sense of reward. So, like, we'll just say accomplishment. And so when someone accomplishes something that they set out to do, they feel good about that, and there's a dopamine release, and they are rewarded. And so, that now has value. So what the dopamine does is, it's not the dopamine that makes someone feel good. It's the dopamine is when something does feel good, that dopamine is released, or it represents, in a sense, neurally a value to something. And that value could be an addictive drug, but it could also be the sense of accomplishment of doing something that you set out to do. And so where I'm going with this statement is, when you talk about education, anything you can do early on to find something that a child is good at, and something hopefully that is has redeeming qualities in society, if you can, work with them to get them to realize that they have that skill and they feel that reward or that accomplishment when they take on that challenge and are successful at that, then in some sense, maybe they get addicted to working hard and doing good things that are important for society. So, I think the things that you were talking about there, Alex, is about sort of recognizing or understanding their own selves in a way to not be pulled in by this kind of addiction is important, but it's probably something that many children will not have really the cognitive skills to deal with until a bit later in life. So, but when we're talking about early, children in the grade school or early grade school, it may be more important to try and find ways to get them to recognize, to feel rewarded internally by their own accomplishments.
I like that point a lot, and I think it's a really interesting problem, right? Like how much to use what we know to sort of stoke and manipulate, if want to put it that way, those kind of valorizing feelings, that things count, that they mean something, right? And that you count, you matter, and so you're going to keep doing the good thing that makes you feel that way, right? So that all sounds, like really important to ingrain the right kinds of habits at the right time in the right way.
Right.
It definitely can be then very very slippery slope where that same feeling, right, takes the place of the thing that is supposed to evoke the feeling, right? The
Yes.
good feeling gets in the way of the actually good thing. And so I guess I would say to always be guided by something that's so good that other sorts of distractions or really manipulations wouldn't deviate you from it. That seems to be part of the goal here.
I think, and I don't remember if we started off mentioning this, but we have talked about sort of these 5 different personality attributes that seem to be related to perhaps addiction generally, but also video game. But to tie that back there, Wes, one of the things that video game addiction seems to be positively correlated with is neuroticism. So, but you could imagine any behavior where you might initially think it's very respectable and redeeming to society, but if the person ends up doing it and because of their and it's just really feeding into their neuroticism, that is, there's it's the success that they're addicted to, and it's sort of self-aggrandizing. Well, that becomes actually what started off, what you hoped would be a positive behavior, may ultimately turn out to be a negative behavior, as they may take on behaviors that glorify themselves at the detriment of others.
Yeah, and just, and this is really speculative, but to what extent you manifest one of those 5 factors, like neuroticism or agreeableness or extroversion, and to what extent those are rooted into physical circuitry in your brain, do you come to serve that temperamental trait as a servant to master, the more you hardwire yourself to meet the world with that trait, because that becomes more known territory, more sort of hardwired into habit to produce those sorts of situations which evoke that sort of response. It seems like that becomes your reality, your habits.
Yeah, I think it does, and we've discussed this somewhat on the consilience conversation, but knowing those traits are your personality, or at least they sort of are the roots of your personality, and no one really wants to have their personalities changed as such. We want to be ourselves to a degree, but people do change over time. It's just a matter of degree, and and tying it also even back to like our free wills, just conversation with Mr. Babcock a few weeks ago. I just like to keep an open mind that people are always able to change. And even though they might have these sort of traits in the here and now, or some combination of these traits in the here and now, the evidence is these things change over time. So
sure, but it also shows the absolute necessity of communication at any given time, because at any given time you are the set of those traits plus, potentially some liquid intelligence and some free will or something like that. Mm-hmm. And so you're never seeing everything, not even close. And so it shows why your perspective is valuable as sort of part of something larger. If, say, we're sort of the individual neurons within the brain, which is our human society, but you need
nice
access
analogy.
to all those other people around you because you do not see much at all.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that's part of what we've talked about also in those conversations on that other sort of series of podcasts is trying to educate individuals about how little they actually may truly be aware of why they make the decisions that they do, why they think the things that they do, and sort of always questioning what they believe, that not what they believe, but what their conscious self had them do versus what their sort of like subconscious self had them do, and their conscious self just sort of retroactively explained why they did what they did.
Right, because they don't understand how a computer works, and that's far less complicated than them.
True.
Wes, what were you? I think I heard you saying something.
Oh no, I was just agreeing. Like, I guess I think that there's again a real interesting question here about like what kinds of games tend to be addictive, because as you're saying, they seem to be addictive to certain kinds of people more so than others, and certain traits that people have would make them more inclined to get addicted or to display addictive behavior or whatever you want to say. But but what kind of games and specifically like from the standpoint of these RPG and fantasy type games, what makes them sort of distinct as a especially problematic or like a special area of interest with respect to this topic? I think would be a question I'd.
Yeah, okay. I wish I wish I had an answer for that. I think it's a great question. I think it's, we touched on it briefly there about how game designers sometimes think about and use research on sort of the pace or how people are rewarded. And it may be that a lot of these role-playing games where you're really immersed are the rewards, maybe not necessarily point rewards, but you're sort of constantly engaged in different tasks. And maybe there's just not necessarily by evil design by corporations, but just by the way these games are set up, there's a great reward schedule, if you will, there. Just like the Candy Crush game that was mentioned in one of those neuroscience papers.
So that's something I wanted to ask you about as a framework for this question, Matt. Mm-hmm. Like two ways of thinking about how to stimulate yourself towards addiction then. One way is the Candy Crush sort of immediate reward, just pure neuroscience way with all the colors and the lights and the novelty that comes at random intervals. But also, I wanted to add to Wes's question the fact that an RPG is a game where you, A, can explore, B, have free choice to some extent, and is C, narratively driven, and for a long period of time. Mm-hmm. And to what extent having a narrative applied to a game fixes a reward schedule and also gives one access to the incentive reward system, because one literally sees one's character develop over time and the problems one can defeat or get through and what one takes from them get more and more complex. And to what extent that, even without knowing it, might be the most addictive possible game. Because
that seems reasonable, or a reasonable speculation or hypothesis that going back to Candy Crush as a not counterexample but a different example. I don't know about you guys, but I don't see a lot of people playing Candy Crush anymore. So these things have a lifespan when they're as simple as Candy Crush is. But now these, as you already mentioned, these games have an overarching narrative or theme, and people are sort of constantly exploring the space. So even if then they get these little rewards, they're ultimately working towards much larger milestones in the games, and that may just keep it going. And maybe the perfect addictive gaming storm.
Well, that might be the perfect model for a most effective education too, and possibly even a life. Honestly speaking, like one in which you are moving towards a superordinate goal, which is like Piaget's equilibrated state, which is also going to work for all the other humans around you in a social context that gives you constant access to the feeling of meaning because you're doing something socially approved of and also sort of neurologically approved of, right? Because you are optimally using your systems for an optimal possible social benefit. And maybe that's what this sort of addiction capacity is missing, that with these games, that's what you're supposed to derive from these games. The structure of the game mimics in some way the way you should structure your real pursuits, and that you need to abstract that, not become addicted to the game itself, not look at the finger pointing at the moon, but the moon, maybe even what the moon means.
Maybe that's I don't want to interrupt if you had more to say on that, Alex, but maybe that's, I know Alex, I know Wes had posted, had a sort of a blog page speaking about some of the hypothesizing, speculating, I don't know what word you might want to use, Wes, about some of the positive ramifications or outcomes of video gaming. And so maybe this would be, I don't know if you had some commentary on that, but maybe that'd be a good time to at least point out what you think some of the positive aspects are.
Sure. Yeah, I think Alex also sort of summarized them briefly at the start here, but it's a post on a games journalism site called the Well-Read Mage, which is a little Final Fantasy pun there. But he talks about big issues and how they relate to games, and so that's a site that I've been fortunate to have some of my writing about Earthbound posted on. And the guy who runs the site, the Well-Read Mage is his handle. He basically wants to sort of get more conversation around ways in which games are beneficial and help you learn things about being a person in the world and stuff like that, and sort of have that as a counterweight, as a better thing to talk about maybe than all the ways in which games are violent and crude and this and that, which was kind of the dominant mainstream media narrative through the 90s when we were growing up, But anyway, I do think that games are essential to education, whether you think of them in kind of concrete ways or in that bigger framework that Alex is kind of sketching there, which with respect to Piaget and all that, which I think is very compelling. And I guess I wanted to ask you, Alex, because you always bring up dopamine and how interesting it is. Is it because it's sort of connected to this sense of meaning that you're so interested in that, and how meaning is constructed neurologically or neurochemically? Well,
so it seems to be the agonist that helps to form your neural systems to become habits. And it seems to be released, or at least from what I've gathered through what I've read and talked about with Matt, during crucial moments during the microprocesses of every behavioral process that you engage in, and potentially even some of your mental processes, insofar as those are related to habits of thought, which are also in some way wired in your brain. And so dopamine just is always coming up in everything we're reading, by the way, everything about habit formation, everything about incentive reward. And it's tied to something that I've felt for a long time, which is this, and you guys can tell me what you think about that there are sort of two ways of living, and Dante seems to hit on this too with his sort of he has three types of sin, but really two. And there are those that seem to be about satisfaction or consummatory reward, things like sex and eating, where when you just sort of, when you engage in the stimulus, then or you receive the stimulus and the motivation disappears. But there are also sort of incentive reward. You also have incentive reward systems where when you make progress towards something, a higher order goal, you receive actually sort of a bigger hit, or as I can see here on the screen, something as big as eating a piece of pepperoni pizza or a dish of ice cream, which is, wonderful. But that the thing is, you can continue forward because once you've gotten that hit, there's nothing except for sort of your energy and interest levels keeping you from continuing to move forward. And I think about that in relation to Piaget's equilibrated state, because what that makes me think is that the greatest possible life is the life of continual incentive, of continually seeking that which produces incentive reward alongside other humans in a pro-social context, and that what that is and how that manifests in mythology is as the hero's journey. And so we have then a physical basis and a behavioral basis to the ultimate sort of fantasy that manifests in literature, song, and video games.
Far out. And as a way of sort of understanding that scientifically, not simply metaphorically, if those terms are used kind of loosely here, like what then does that do to us when we become sort of self-conscious and aware of that as this kind of superordinate goal?
I think we have to pursue the ultimate aim and talk about what that is.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. No, it seems like a massive project, but it strikes me that science, and maybe you can correct me or layer something under this blanket statement here, but it seems like most scientists seem not to have a kind of overarching goal. They're sort of like engaged in relatively small pockets of interest and with sort of limited aims and things that are quantifiable, right? And so to talk about it in this kind of philosophical way strikes me as difficult to get to jive with the scientific like ethos, so to speak, or like what they do day to day. I don't know, like, but it's cool that I mean I really admire the whole consilience concept and to try to kind of bring the more humanistic and the more scientific threads together in a bigger project. Yeah, that's a lot. I don't know. What do you guys make of that?
Oh, well, I guess I could probably add something to this. So to your latter point there, Wes, or to your main point about sort of connections or disconnections between scientists and the scientific community and philosophers or the humanities, that is part of what our conciliates conversations are about. I think there are a lot. I'll speak specifically about neuroscience and neuroscientists, of which there are many, and there are just so many different fields of study, and they are neuroscientists that this is the way science by some degree has to be. And I know it doesn't. We would like to be more broad and for individuals to have a broader view of things, but the world is so complex. The world of science is so complex that people have to specialize and they have to dig deep. On the other hand, there are plenty of scientists that I've spoken to, neuroscientists that are high level, very accomplished individuals in the field. And a lot of them are very knowledgeable, especially at the sort of cognitive or systems neuroscience, about philosophy, sort of the grander goal. But, they have to publish, they have to do physical research and publish papers. And so they're not going to, that's their job. That's what they're paid to do. And so they can't, always make these ties apparent in their publications that just go into academic journals. I guess the other thing I wanted to comment on, and so, I don't know if I really answered some questions there other than up from your statements, Wes, other than it's true. The scientists have to focus on sort of their physical experiments, and that's the key. But getting back a little bit to sort of taking two steps back to this connection to dopamine, I think one of the things there is there's a blessing and a curse that we've come to discover some elements about the brain and this reward system that dopamine is tied to. And dopamine has many other modulatory roles as well. So let's to think of it solely as something that is representing reward or motivating us to take actions in order to receive that reward is not quite correct. That's sort of the problem, is that we understand some basic elements and we also understand some sort of nuanced elements too. What comes out in the media and what people can easily understand is dopamine is reward. And then when you have these sort of papers that show that people that have played video games for a long time and are sort of maybe not technically addicted according to the clinical diagnoses, but certainly it's sort of a disorder, that they see, aspects of their brain activity and brain anatomy that are related to those that might be addicted to certain drugs, right? Okay, well, that's interesting, and people sort of sometimes latch on to that, and that's why there's sort of sometimes some of the argument towards, we got to call this an addiction. But as sort of like this bullet point here says, well, video gaming can raise dopamine levels just as much as going and having a piece of pizza or having a dish of ice cream. One other line I read in one of the papers was, so I'll pause and say that. So what does that mean? Because dopamine is it's all over the place. It's always rewarding us for a variety of things and having other roles in the brain. So to jump to the conclusion that this is an addictive, that this is addictive in a negative way is really, that's oversimplistic and probably false in many ways. And the final thing I wanted to say is that I think this goes about 5 steps back in our conversation, is that you might have certain personalities. We said this early on, that might drive someone to close them off from society, right? They already have sort of so the addiction isn't really the problem. It's a manifestation or a symptom of the problem. And one of the quotes I read, someone said, was that if someone's depressed, they may lay in bed all day, but they're not addicted to the bed, right? So it may be that sort of something like video game addiction more so is a problem with other, it's really just a symptom of a greater problem. So anyway, that was a whole host of just kind of a few bullet points that addressed our last 15 minutes of conversation, but I wanted to get those out there.
Well, that's so interesting too, because it makes me think about the relationship of neuroticism to dominance hierarchy position, and to what extent boys are especially liable to be subject to that in adolescence, because of course they're now sort of, adults, but females don't have much time for them because they're so low hierarchy position at that point. And there's so many, so many guys who are higher on the hierarchy. So it makes sense that men would be more neurotic when they're younger and weaker and less skilled. And to what extent that would make them more liable to seek a space that was safer to orient themselves to, like a video game. And to what extent also, boys are more likely to become addicted to video games because they are less agreeable by temperament, writ large, and games tend to be competitive endeavors. They can be cooperative as well, but there tends to be a goal where you win or lose at the end. And so I wonder to what extent video games really would hit like sort of young, low dominance, males who are potentially higher in or lower in agreeableness.
But maybe that also, one thing you didn't mention there, but is connections between younger males and sort of attention deficit disorders.
That's right.
And some of these games there's just constantly things going on, such that it's actually perhaps counterintuitive that you don't need to have a focus of attention at all times. If there's certain games might have a long arc to them, and you really do have to pay attention for a long time. But that may feed into this, to this as well, as to why they might affect boys more so than girls, in addition to the items that you speculated on there, Alex.
All right. And I was also wondering to what extent, if it were boys who are more likely to get addicted to video games, to what extent that would be connected to the fact that there are more boys who are diagnosed with ADHD, and to what extent that would be connected to the lack of rough and tumble play in high school, and to what extent video games are like a neurotic substitute for that, and how that might relate, A, to parenting practices. And I don't think we have time for this, but also B, to educational practices, to what extent, kids in general, but also especially boys with their, higher levels of aggression and lower agreeableness, need to get out and move their bodies and play, even from a neural standpoint.
Sure. Yeah, maybe they that's more necessary for them, as well as connecting it back to the type of video games. Maybe, if parents have if they have the willpower to try and get their kids to play games that it's not about first shooter games. I'm not trying to say anything negative about that particularly, but games that require them to sort of have a longer, more drawn out thought process, and are not just a quick response process that is feeding on a high frequency reward schedule.
Right. Well, Wes.
Yeah.
What should we end this with?
Well, shoot, I don't know. I mean, just trying to get Matt to play Final Fantasy VII with us so we can talk more often, I guess.
How many hours am I going to need to dedicate to be with you guys? What's my training regimen going to need to be?
Oh, man. Conservatively speaking, 40 hours, but, you know, you could probably just watch some walkthroughs if you wanted to at this point, if you wanted to catch up with us. And
I'll you know, as you know, Alex, I'll be in your area in another week or two. So maybe I'll just dedicate that 40 hours to my my time in your region.
Yeah. That I can't think of anything better for you to do in San Diego.
Right. No, I don't need to see any of the beauty of the world out there.
And I guess that's for the listeners too. And did you say it's a week now, Matt?
I'll be out there in about a week and a half.
About a week and a half. We're gonna try and get an episode out there on video with Matt here in the home office, and so the studio. And so it is pretty nice here, Matt. So I'm looking forward to this, and I hope that gets to happen. And I'm looking forward to continuing this conversation. And well, yeah, if Wes is good with it, and you want to, I'd love to have you on here again sometime, and we can talk about this issue more, or one of the other mini issues that we need to get to.
This is so much to do, so little time. We'll do what we can.
There's a whole slew of psychological issues that are brought up in Final Fantasy VII. So yeah, no shortage of topics. Yeah, it'd be great.
Cool.
Yeah, and that maybe even just broadly, I want to understand how we can become connected to inanimate objects, like holy objects, or like our pet seal, stuffed seal growing up, and then eventually our video game systems, to where we're actually, I read this today, we'll be motivated to do violence to defend them. We'll activate defensive aggression against our own family members. And wow, that's very strong. So I want to understand a lot more about that, because it seems like objects, that does not make the world less holy. It makes objects actually far more holy, and makes me understand the roots of private property in a much deeper way than I ever had before.
Far out.
Sounds like interesting stuff. Yeah, great.
Yeah, well, thank you. Thank you as usual, Wes, and thank you very much, Dr. Bruce, Matt, for coming on and doing something a little bit different today. And thanks, guys.
Yeah, always a pleasure. Alex. Thank you.